So it's pretty uncontroversial that existentialism began with Jean Paul Sartre. He was one of the only people who sort of called himself an existentialist. And he was heavily influenced by the philosophers we've talked about so far in this chapter, which is why I kind of think of it as leading up to talking about him. He especially liked the idea that we choose our own essence, and this is one of his most important ideas that underlies all his philosophy. And he got this to some extent from Heidegger and Husserl and Nietzsche and all these people who came before him, kind of set the stage for this sort of idea. So he says existence precedes essence. And what this means is that we don't have a sort of human nature that precedes us. We're not born with something called human nature. We're born with just existence, and then essence, or our nature, is something that we develop over time. So, but he doesn't think this development is passive. We think of it like, oh, our experiences shape us and we're shaped by our experiences. He doesn't think of it that way. Instead, he really focuses on the idea of choice. So we aren't affected passively by what happens to us. We shape our own essence by our choices. So he thinks that every situation involves choice, even situations where we might think we don't have a choice. Like if we're facing a firing squad, we have the choice to die standing up or sitting on the ground. So we might not have a choice not to die. Our choices might be limited, our choices might be difficult, but we always have a choice according to him. And importantly, we think of, we make this choice because of who we are, what kind of person we are. He thinks that instead the choices make us the kind of person we are. So we don't start out being a certain kind of person who makes certain kind of choices. The choices make us into who we are and what kind of essence that we have. So in his probably best novel, Nausea, he draws on Kierkegaard's idea of dread and the prospect of our own freedom to make choices being overwhelming. So his main character in this novel, Antoine, realizes the meaninglessness of his life, but he doesn't really understand that he has to make the meaning for his life. So Sartre uses this person who doesn't understand what existentialists think of as the best way to live in order to kind of show the best way to live. So Antoine fails to make meaning for himself because he didn't realize he needed to. He didn't think that was part of what he was supposed to do. He didn't understand how his choices made meaning for him. So he thought that just life was meaningless. And like Nietzsche, Sartre doesn't believe that life has to be meaningless. He believes that it starts meaningless, but that we can make meaning for it. And this idea that there isn't any predetermined essence or nature for people extends to morality. He thinks that there's no formula for making perfect choices. So the Kantians and the utilitarians think that you can make up a moral code or rules or guidelines that will help us make the right moral choices. Instead, Sartre thought that we had to figure this out for ourselves on an individual basis. So he tells us his famous story about a student who comes from an advice about whether to stay at home and help his mother or join the Free French forces in World War II. And if the student left, the mother would be devastated because his brother had already been killed in the war and his father was estranged from her. So anyway, she needed his help is the point. And so he wanted to fight the Nazis, but he also had this feeling of obligation toward his mother. And according to Sartre, these regular moral theories wouldn't help the student. A Kantian or utilitarian could argue for either decision he could make. The utilitarian could argue that it would make more happiness for him to try to defeat Hitler, but then on the other hand, the utilitarian could also say, well, that was either going to happen anyway, and your contribution wouldn't make that much difference, so really the happiness would be increased more by you helping your mother, and there doesn't seem to be a really good way to sort of measure that. And then a Kantian could also argue that he has a duty to his mother or that he has a duty to his country. So it seems like it's not really good at answering that question for him. So Sartre told the student to choose for himself, because he said in any case nobody can tell him what the choice should be. The student's own feelings can't guide him, because it seems like the only way we really know how we feel about something is when we act. And so he says that the student ended up choosing to help his mother, but it wasn't his depth of feeling for his mother that guided his decision. Instead, the feelings for his mother were revealed by his choice to stay with her. So it wasn't as though he chose because he loved her. It's like his love for her came out in the fact that he chose. So even choosing to ask Sartre for advice was a choice, because the student would already know to some extent what Sartre was going to tell him. So he's making a choice even when he's saying that he's asking for advice. And then these choices also create our essence, and also for Sartre it creates meaning for the world, because the world doesn't really mean anything on its own. We create the meaning through our choices. And especially since, according to Sartre, so Sartre doesn't believe in God, he thinks that the world can't really create its own meaning, that we create the meaning for the world through our lives and our choices. So when he said this, of course, people said, well, you're just a relativist. All you do is think that people should just do what's best for themselves, and the individual and them making their choices based on their situation is really just ethical egoism or individualism. And it seems like that's all we're doing in this situation. But Sartre didn't think this way, and he did think that there was a right and wrong. He really hated the Nazis. He really thought that certain political systems were good and others were bad. He had a lot of views about this, so he did not want to be a relativist. So he wrote this lecture, Existentialism is Humanism, to try to fight against these charges. It's not clear how successful it was, but he argued that when we make choices, we're not choosing just for ourselves, but also for humanity as a whole. So he points out that humanity is a community, and that we can't really know ourselves except as part of humanity and part of a community. So when we are acting, we're not just acting for ourselves or choosing for ourselves, but we're also deciding for the rest of humanity. It's not clear how that's supposed to work, because if the student is choosing to stay with his mother, it's not clear how that's choosing for humanity. But this is what he tried to argue. So again, he wanted to say that there wasn't a common human nature, but he did believe that we are all similar in important ways, and that we share a similar situation in the universe, so that this was, again, part of his argument that when we're constructing our own essence, we're also implicitly sort of constructing everybody's essence at the same time and creating universal value for everyone. Again, it's not exactly clear how that's supposed to work, but in any case, that's what he tried to argue. And then he also used this idea of bad faith to say that we can judge other people, or that we can make moral judgments. And his idea of bad faith is that we can judge others for lying to themselves. So it's important to note that lying involves knowing that something is false, but also claiming it's true in order to fool somebody else. That's what lying is. So if we're lying to ourselves, he goes through a long thing in this essay called Bad Faith, how we're supposed to be able to do that. How can we lie to ourselves when we know the truth? Because you have to know the truth in order to lie, right? So how can we lie to ourselves? And he says that in order to do this, we have to flee from or escape ourselves, in a sense, separate from ourselves. And when we do this, we're kind of claiming, we're trying to discard the responsibility that we actually have for our own actions. So we're trying to run from this freedom that we have, that, remember, Kierkegaard talked about, that this freedom to choose that comes with the responsibility of the choice. We're kind of running from that if we are lying to ourselves. And he says if we're not honest with ourselves about who we are and our place in the universe, we'll make bad decisions. So bad faith is bad because we're not going to make good choices if we're fleeing from ourselves and not admitting to ourselves about who we really are and what our place is in the universe. So he says existentialists can judge somebody else to be wrong if they're acting in bad faith, if they're in denial of their universal humanity and their part in the human race. So that's his attempt, again, to get around the idea that, existentialism is just ethical egoism, because he doesn't want that, but it does kind of seem to follow to a lot of people from a lot of his views. So he tries to focus on this idea of community and this idea of being honest with ourselves about our place in the world, and that will help us know what we ought to do.